Welcome to the Madison Miller Podcast. Today is Monday, April 13th, 2020. Today I'm going to talk about the latest news within the coronavirus. A big name in the national news media tests positive, and how the NFL draft coverage will go about within the networks. The NBA horse competition, the latest former sports games that were aired, I want to talk about a little bit. My 2016 NFL ReDraft, and my top 10 NFL players and top 10 NFL games of the calendar year 2018. All right, we'll start with the coronavirus. The big name person in the national media that tested positive was ABC's George Stephanopoulos. This comes to a surprise, obviously. He's somebody that is obviously a really good host on Good Morning America, and he said on Monday on the show that he had tested positive, and his wife, Allie Wentworth, tested positive about 2 weeks ago, and Stephanopoulos said that he is asymptomatic, so that's good. And hopefully he gets well soon. He's obviously still doing the show, and he's probably doing it from home. I haven't really watched GMA, but he's probably doing it from home, and hopefully he and his wife get well soon. So that's that. And then the other coronavirus-related item that I want to get to is the NFL draft coverage, which is all virtual. They announced today the broadcasting team for the draft. They're pretty much doing a combined coverage with NFL Network, pretty much. So ESPN and NFL Network, Trey Wingo will host all 3 days of ESPN's NFL draft coverage for the fourth consecutive year. Based in Bristol, Wingo will be joined remotely by Mel Kiper, Louis Riddick, Booger McFarland, NFL Network's Rich Eisen, draft analyst Daniel Jeremiah, and Hall of Famers Michael Irvin and Kurt Warner will also contribute remotely all 3 days. Host Susie Colbert will conduct remote interviews with the draftees from an ESPN studio, and the insiders, obviously Chris Mortensen and Adam Schefter, will again be part of the 3-day telecast, providing updates from their respective homes. So that's pretty significant. I've seen nothing about Ian Rappaport. He'll probably be reporting and whatnot, but he obviously is not listed in the coverage here. He's their NFL Network's big time reporter, like their version of Adam Schefter. And it's funny because Schefter obviously used to be with them, and now he's over at ESPN, thriving and doing what he loves to do. So should be a fun broadcast. I like that the two networks are coming together. I think it's a really neat idea. Obviously, Eisen used to work at ESPN, so he's friends with a lot of the people from over there. And Eisen has no harsh feelings towards ESPN. Eisen's just a great guy, and obviously his wife's involved still to this day with ESPN as well. So both him and his wife are going to be on the coverage. Schefter, you have Mortensen, who have been staples of the NFL draft coverage on ESPN the last couple of years. Trey Wingo, who I think is a pretty good host, better than given credit for, in my opinion, because I just feel that he gets a little too much slack. Meanwhile, I think he does a great job at what he does and is a good co-host with Mike Golick in the mornings on Golick and Wingo. So that's good to see that Wingo is involved in the draft coverage again. Now I want to talk about the NBA horse competition. It was boring in my opinion, but I'll just go over the results and who's on to the semifinal. You had first Trae Young and Chauncey Billups. Trae Young was out to a good lead, and then Chauncey Billups came back and defeated Trae Young. Allie Quigley knocked off Chris Paul. Mike Conley won his round. And then Zach LaVine defeated Paul Pierce. And it was a shutout by LaVine for him to go on. And Conley won easily against Tamika Catchings. So the quarterfinals of the horse tournament will be Chauncey Billups versus Mike Conley and Allie Quigley against Zach LaVine. I like the Allie Quigley-Zach LaVine combo going against each other because obviously Quigley's a player on the Chicago Sky and Zach LaVine plays for the Chicago Bulls, so you have a little Chicago versus Chicago there. So I like that. And then Conley against Billups. Let's see if the ex-NBA player in Billups could continue his little run here on Thursday night when the semifinals will happen. Now I want to talk about old sports classics and just old games in general that were reared over the weekend. In my opinion, one of the best games ever and one of the best upsets in the history of sports, Super Bowl 42, Giants over the Patriots. Patriots were obviously going for 18-0 or 19-0. They were 18-0 combined with the regular season and the postseason. Then they run into the Giants, who played them very well in Week 17. As the Patriots were trying for undefeated, the Giants were trying to lock up a playoff spot. So they rematch, and it's a great game. Defenses on both sides play well, and then the quarterbacks made some big plays in the fourth quarter. Giants took a 10-7 lead in the fourth quarter, and then the Patriots went up with like 2:45 to go as Tom Brady found, I believe it was Randy Moss in the end zone to put them up 14-10. Then we all know what happens. Eli to Tyree with the big play, and then eventually Eli to Burris, 17-10. And then the Giants hang on. Their defense played great in that game. It was Michael Strahan's last game. Justin Tuck came onto the scenes that year. It was like Eli Manning's coming out party, in my opinion. He obviously was a late bloomer as a quarterback, and I think the best quarterback in Giants history. So it was his little coming out party. He won the Super Bowl MVP that year, and then he obviously won the Super Bowl MVP again in 2012. So two-time Super Bowl champion and MVP, Eli Manning. And then Grizzlies Thunder. These two NBA teams had a nice little, now I don't want to say rivalry, but a couple good series that each won 7 games, and they reared 2011 where they went 7. Memphis was an 8 seed that had come off the upset of the Spurs. Thunder, up-and-coming team led by Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and then James Harden was still there back then. And then Game 7 was at Oklahoma City. The Thunder won in blowout fashion. Russell Westbrook triple-double. And at the time, everybody thought that the Thunder were this up-and-coming team, the next NBA dynasty that was going to go toe-to-toe with the Miami Heat and LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh for years to come. And then they ended up facing the Heat in the 2012 finals, but ended up losing. And then they underachieved a couple times after that. Kevin Durant was hurt one year. Russell Westbrook got hurt in the playoffs one year. And then Durant ended up leaving in 2016 to go to Golden State. Then Westbrook ended up getting traded this past summer to Houston after the Thunder traded away Paul George. And I remember they acquired Paul George in the summer of 2017. And he was there for a couple of years. They actually re-signed him in 2018. And then OKC, George wanted out of there to go play with Kawhi Leonard with the Clippers. And that's how the Kawhi Leonard thing ended up happening. They ended up pulling off that Paul George trade and traded all those pieces to the Thunder. So it's funny looking back where now both these franchises are in rebuild and transition phases respectively. The Thunder have exceeded so many expectations this year. Everyone thought they were going to be terrible because everyone thought they were going to trade Chris Paul, who ended up getting traded to OKC in the deal that sent Westbrook to Houston. And then they ended up keeping Chris Paul, and then they go on a nice run, and maybe if the season resumes, they'll be playing in the postseason. And then the Grizzlies, they had a nice little run after that, made the conference finals in 2013, and then the wheels kind of unraveled after, I believe, 2016 or 17, and they were in the lottery. And then they ended up trading away Marc Gasol and Mike Conley, who were the grit and grind, two key pieces of that team. And then they had Zach Randolph, who actually turned into a pretty good third option / role guy for them. Tony Douglas was on that team. Tony Allen was on that team, who had championship experience from the Celtics and was a good backup point guard off the bench for them. Courtney Lee was on that team at one point. They had some nice role guys. Mike Miller was there for a year. But yeah, that was like the coming out party for Mike Conley and Marc Gasol, that 2011 playoff run. Another classic game that was on over the weekend was Cowboys-Jets, 2011 Week 1. It was the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. The Jets were chosen to be in that game over the Giants for whatever reason. And then obviously the Cowboys are involved because they're the Cowboys. And it was just coincidence that the Cowboys were playing the AFC East that year, and they played the Jets. The Jets had high expectations that year. There were people that picked them to overtake the Patriots in the AFC East and perhaps go to the Super Bowl. Everybody thought that Mark Sanchez was going to be this breakout star quarterback. And then the Cowboys people were high on that year as well because Tony Romo was coming off the injury. And they made some improvements to their team. And that game was really, really good. The Cowboys had a double-digit lead going into the fourth quarter. And the Jets came from behind the win. There was a couple lucky breaks and turnovers that got the Jets back into that game. There was a blocked punt. And then obviously at the end, Tony Romo threw an interception to Darrelle Revis, which set up the game-winning field goal by Nick Folk. That was a really good game. Another memorable MetLife Stadium game was 2010 Week 15, Eagles-Giants. Obviously, that's going to be remembered for the game where Deshaun Jackson ran back the punt for a touchdown to win the game. And the Eagles came back from a big deficit and won that game, ended up winning the NFC East over the Giants. The Giants had a big lead in the NFC East, and that game really crippled the Giants. Although they recovered the next year and won the Super Bowl. And then the Eagles that year that they won the division, courtesy of that game, ended up losing in the first round to Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. A couple other games that were on were the 2019 Stanley Cup Finals games 5, 6, and 7. The road team won each of those games, and that's kind of ironic. The Blues won in Boston and won Game 5. The Bruins won Game 6 in St. Louis, and then the Blues won Game 7 in Boston. And obviously Game 7 will be remembered as the game where the Blues won their first Stanley Cup in franchise history. 2018 Stanley Cup Final Game 6, obviously it was the Penguins and the Red Wings. The Penguins were that up-and-coming team. People thought that was the next dynasty in the league. Crosby, Malkin, they had Jordan Stahl on their team back then. Marc-Andre Fleury was coming into his own. And then the Red Wings, who were like that aging team at the end of their dynasty. They were going for, I believe, their fourth cup in a 9-year span or something like that. But they had a nice little run there in the 2000s and even in the late 90s as well. So the Red Wings won Game 6, and then Game 7, 2009, was in Detroit, where Pittsburgh won Game 7 on the road. The funny thing about these two games was that at the last play of the game was a huge save by the goaltender to make that one final save in a one-goal game to prevent their team from blowing a one-goal lead in the Stanley Cup Final. So those two games are very reminiscent of one another with the same two teams, except Detroit was home in 2009 and Pittsburgh was home in 2008, and obviously the road teams won both those respective games. 2011 NBA Finals games 2 and 6 were on. Miami won Game 1 of that series. Game 2 was won by Dallas. Dirk Nowitzki really had a great game in Game 2, and this series will be remembered as the lone finals where LeBron lost to a superior team. And obviously, Dirk deserves all the credit in the world, and so does Rick Carlisle. Tyson Chandler was a big piece of that team. J.J. Barea was put in the starting lineup. He was a good piece for them. Brendan Haywood was a good big off the bench. There's a lot of good players on that Dallas team that weren't superstars per se, but they were good at what they did. Like Tyson Chandler was obviously good at what he did, and J.J. Barea was good in his role. Stojakovic was good in his role. Obviously, Brendan Haywood was good in his role. And there's a lot of other solid players on that team. Obviously, Jason Terry off the bench hitting big threes. Jason Kidd was on that team too. So, a lot of big names on that team that really helped Dirk out to win his only NBA championship. And then Game 6 was not a blowout. It was actually a close game. Miami had the lead a lot in Game 6, but ultimately Dallas and Dirk pulled away and came away victorious in that game and then in that series. Now I'm going to do my 2016 NFL redraft. This draft was absolutely loaded, so there's going to be some good players that were not picked in the top 32. And this was a weird one because obviously there were teams that took quarterbacks highly rated, but now like the perception of some of those quarterbacks have changed and whatnot. So without further ado, here we go. Number 1, Los Angeles Rams, Joey Bosa. Yes, I have them taking Joey Bosa over a quarterback. Joey Bosa is probably the best player from this draft. He was perceived as the best player in this draft for a while. And then ultimately the Rams trade up to the number 1 spot, courtesy of the Titans, and take Jared Goff. So Joey Bosa, imagine him and Aaron Donald together. And let's say Case Keenum was their backup quarterback at the time. And Case Keenum's an above-average backup quarterback, but not a great starting quarterback. And him, with a lot of talent around him, actually did him wonders. Just see in 2017 with Minnesota. So maybe he could have had that same success with the Rams in 2016 if Joey Bosa and all those guys that they currently have, or that they had at the time, and maybe in 2017 he had success with the Rams rather than the Vikings. 2, the Philadelphia Eagles, Jalen Ramsey. Boy, he would have been a great pick at, not at the time of the draft, obviously, but now looking back, the Eagles quarterback at the time was Sam Bradford. And then they ended up trading him to Minnesota because Teddy Bridgewater got injured and they got a first-round pick out of it. So, say Sam Bradford's their quarterback in 2016, and you had Jalen Ramsey to a defense that had Malcolm Jenkins in his prime, or secondary that had Jenkins in his prime, and a couple other guys that they had at the time that were actually decent. And obviously, the Rams at number 1 took Jared Goff, and the Eagles at 2 took Carson Wentz. 3, Los Angeles Chargers, Ronnie Stanley. So with Joey Bosa off the board, the Chargers go with Ronnie Stanley. They were obviously the San Diego Chargers at the time. He certainly would have helped Phillip Rivers in that offensive line. And they have a lot of good skill position players on that team and did back then. So he certainly would have helped Phil Rivers, had some success. 4, the Dallas Cowboys, Yannick Ngakoue. Ngakoue is somebody that obviously wants out of Jacksonville right now. He was a Steeler where the Jaguars took him. Could you just imagine him on that defense? And obviously at the time the Cowboys had Tony Romo. Let's say Tony Romo doesn't get injured, and the Cowboys have Tony Romo, that really good offensive line, and a good defense led by Ngakoue, DeMarcus Lawrence, and they had some other decent players there at the time as well, and instead they took Ezekiel Elliott. 5, the Jacksonville Jaguars, Michael Thomas. I was going to consider Carson Wentz or another quarterback here, but I feel like I'd be reaching. But at the time, the Jaguars had Blake Bortles, who they were still high on as a starter. So with Ramsey off the board, I have them taking Michael Thomas, who the Jaguars during the tenure of Bortles lacked that number one receiver. They had Allen Robinson, but he got injured. But Michael Thomas certainly would have helped whatever cause they had for their quarterback. 6, the Baltimore Ravens. Laramie Tunsil. With Ronnie Stanley off the board, they go with Tunsil here, who obviously fell in the draft because of the smoking machine thing that he had. And everybody got spooked off. And the Dolphins landed themselves a steal, and then they ended up trading Tunsil away to the Houston Texans so they could tank. Tunsil, obviously, is a solid player, and he certainly would have been a help to that offensive line as well. But right now, I'd say Ronnie Stanley is probably the better lineman because he's somebody that really came into his own this season. 7, the 49ers. Carson Wentz. So the 49ers take a quarterback after their experiment with Colin Kaepernick came to an end. They had bad quarterbacks before they eventually acquired Garoppolo. Could you imagine a world where Carson Wentz is the guy that he was in 2017 before the injury with the 49ers, who had, at the time, they didn't have the best talent, but they still had some leftover pieces from the Harbaugh years, and then they ended up drafting pretty well, and then they ended up with Carson Wentz and all the pieces that they have today. That would have been something else if healthy Carson Wentz on the Niners. And in this spot, the 49ers ended up taking DeForest Buckner. Not a bad pick. 8, the Tennessee Titans. DeForest Buckner. So Buckner drops one spot to 8. Titans take Buckner to pair up with Jarrell Casey on that pass rush. Buckner had a career year last year, and then now he's on the Indianapolis Colts and should help their defensive line out tremendously. And instead, the Titans went with Jack Conklin, who we'll get to in a little bit. The Chicago Bears at number 9 go with Ryan Kelly, the center. At the time, the Bears had Jay Cutler, and they were still pretty high on him, although they were a little frustrated as well. So they take the center here to improve their offensive line. Number 10, the New York Giants. And by the way, the Bears in this spot instead took Leonard Floyd. New York Giants at 10 take Jalen Smith. This is a steal for the Giants here, taking the linebacker Smith, who really has changed the dynamic of the Cowboys front seven. He's somebody that the Cowboys are very high on. They already paid him, and they should have paid him. He's a very good player that was undervalued at the time of the draft because he was coming off an injury. So the Giants' defense with Jalen Smith would be perceived a lot differently than it is now. And instead, they took Eli Apple. Number 11, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers took Chris Jones in the redraft. So I have them taking Chris Jones, who's obviously a pass rusher on the Kansas City Chiefs, who the Chiefs probably will trade so they can clear up cap space to sign Mahomes to that big extension that's just inevitable. Chris Jones is a very good player, and he'll help wherever he gets traded to, or unless the Chiefs decide to keep him and pay him. So you never know, and certainly he would have helped the Bucs as well. And instead, they took Vernon Hargreaves. 12, the New Orleans Saints, Kevin Byard. So the Saints go with Byard here to help their secondary. They ended up rebuilding their defense really well, but Kevin Byard in that defense would have been interesting. And instead, the Saints took Sheldon Rankins. 13, the Miami Dolphins, Ezekiel Elliott. With Laramie Tunsil off the board, they go with Zeke, who falls to them at 13. You could argue that Zeke could have gone in multiple different spots in this redraft, including where he did go in the real draft at 4 to the Cowboys. But this is pretty much a weird redraft where I have not only ranking the players necessarily, but the fit and what each team needs. So it's a combination of everything, and the Dolphins at the time needed a young back to help Ryan Tannehill out on offense, and Ezekiel Elliott would have been fine there. Although the Dolphins, in their perception, last couple years have taken a little bit of a hit. Although they look like they're heading in a good direction now. They hired the right guy in Flores, and they'll probably take Tua Tagovailoa or a quarterback with the 5th pick, or unless they trade up. 14, the Raiders take Derrick Henry. Henry really has come into his own the last few years. Tennessee really likes him. They placed a franchise tag on him. We'll see if they extend him. Maybe they won't, because they saw what happened with the Rams and Todd Gurley. So, Derrick Henry would have been a really good security guy for Derek Carr and helped him a lot, take some pressure off of him. Instead, the Raiders took Carl Joseph. 15, the Browns, Dak Prescott. So the second quarterback comes off the board with Prescott, who goes to 15 to the Browns. He ended up being a 4th-round pick that proved many people wrong, led the Cowboys to the playoffs twice. And there's some doubters out there still to this day because of those 2 seasons where they didn't make the playoffs. But then again, who was coaching them? Jason Garrett. And they get an upgraded coach with Mike McCarthy. So Dallas may have found their guy for the next few years. But even I think the Cowboys have some doubts because they still haven't signed him yet. And then the Browns, with Prescott and the pieces they have, would have been interesting for sure. And instead they took Corey Coleman. 16, the Lions, Joe Thuney, somebody who really came into his own with the Patriots these last couple years. They franchise tagged him after many thought he'd bolt in free agency. And he would have helped Matt Stafford in that offense. Instead, they took Taylor Decker. 17, the Atlanta Falcons, Xavier Howard. Xavier Howard was a steal at where Miami took him. And he's somebody that really would have been a fun person to see in that secondary with Desmond Trufant. And instead, the Falcons ended up taking Keanu Neal, who is a really good player. 18, the Colts, Jack Conklin. With Ryan Kelly off the board, they go with Conklin, somebody who just got paid by the Browns. Someone who was a good lineman for the Titans, who I think they'll miss. Instead, the Colts took Ryan Kelly. Like I said, that ended up being a solid pick. 19, the Buffalo Bills, Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, I think, is proven to be the best receiver from this class. He's Patrick Mahomes' number 1 weapon in Kansas City. And can you imagine what he would have been on the Bills? 20, the Jets. And by the way, the Bills at 19 took Shaq Lawson. Jets at 20 go with Deion Jones, someone who the Falcons stole in the 3rd round, a solid linebacker, and he certainly would have been better than Darren Lee, who they took at 20. 21, the Texans, Jared Goff. At the time, the Texans needed a quarterback, but they decided to wait a year, and then they ended up trading up for Deshaun Watson, which looks like a wise decision looking back, but this is a redraft of 2016, and at the time, the Texans needed a quarterback, so I have them snagging Jared Goff here, and maybe his career would have gone a little better. And I'm not saying that Goff's a bust or anything, but he certainly would have had a better receiver in Hopkins than anybody he has with the Rams, but the Rams are obviously had a better roster than the Texans. 22, the Washington Redskins. And by the way, the Texans at 21 took Will Fuller. The Redskins at 22 take Austin Hooper. Yeah, they did have a couple tight ends at the time, but Jordan Reed had really proven to be concussion prone, but not quite yet. So they take another tight end with Hooper to go in that offense with Kirk Cousins at the time. 23, the Vikings. By the way, the 22, the Redskins took Josh Doxson. Vikings at 23 take Kenny Clark, someone who the Packers stole in the second round, a solid defensive lineman for them. Instead, the Vikings took Laquan Treadwell. 24, the Cincinnati Bengals, Joe Schobert. So they snagged the underrated linebacker here with Schobert, who's now a member of the Jaguars and was picked by the Browns later in this draft. He certainly would have helped Cincinnati. Instead, the Bengals took William Jackson. 25, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Nick Kwiatkowski. At the time, the Steelers really needed help on their defense. Kwiatkowski would have been a really good fit. Instead, they took Arnie Burns. 26, the Denver Broncos, Kendall Fuller. I think this is a steal of a pick by Denver. He certainly would have helped them in their secondary after helping the Redskins at first and then the Chiefs, and especially helping the Chiefs win the Super Bowl this past year. Instead, they took Paxton Lynch. 27, the Green Bay Packers, Matt Judon. Judon had a career year with the Ravens this past year and now is on the franchise tag. He certainly would have helped Green Bay as well. Instead, they took Kenny Clark. Oh, by the way, they took him in the first round, not the second round. That was my mistake. 28, the 49ers. Cody Whitehair. Whitehair is somebody that is underrated. The Bears stole him in one of the later rounds, and he certainly would have been better than Joshua Garnett, who they traded up for in this spot. 29, the Arizona Cardinals. Corey Littleton, an underrated linebacker, in my opinion. Now with the Raiders and started off with the Rams. He would have certainly helped Arizona. Instead, they took Robert Nimdici. 30, the Panthers take Keanu Neal, somebody who was taken earlier in the actual draft by the Falcons. When healthy, a star, but really hasn't been healthy, and that's certainly a concern. He would have helped the Panthers too. And instead, they took Vernon Butler. And in 31, the Seahawks, Hunter Henry, somebody who really would have helped Russell Wilson and that offense, especially over Jimmy Graham and any other tight end that they've had. And instead, they ended up taking Jermaine Ifedi. And by the way, the Patriots didn't have a pick in this draft because of Deflategate's punishments. Okie dokie. Now I'm going to do my top 10 NFL players of 2018. I have a couple honorable mentions. Tom Brady, Todd Gurley, Alvin Kamara, Julio Jones, Von Miller. And here we go, the top 10 players. 10, Michael Thomas was a big help on that Saints team that really should have been the NFC's representative in the Super Bowl that year, but they were robbed of the call. We talked about that many times. And then he really did come into his own that season. 9th, J.J. Watt, continuing helping the Texans overachieve year after year, being the leader of that defense. 8, DeAndre Hopkins, Houston Texans, being one of the best receivers in the league, helping Deshaun Watson's development. 7, Antonio Brown. He was having a great season, and then all the off-field incidents happened, and he was never really heard from again in the NFL, unfortunately. But he did see time with the Patriots for a week there. Number 6, Quentin Nelson, Indianapolis Colts. The drafting of him, he came in and was a star immediately, Pro Bowler, All-Pro player, really helped the rejuvenation of Andrew Luck, who I have at number 5 on this list. He carried the Colts to the second round that year, and they ended up getting blown out by the Chiefs in the second round. 4, Drew Brees, New Orleans Saints. He really helped lead the Saints back to the postseason after the crushing loss to the Vikings in the divisional round. And then the next year, the Saints ended up being the 1 seed in the NFC. And Brees was just fantastic that season. 3, Khalil Mack, Chicago Bears. Helped lead the Bears to the playoffs after getting traded from the Raiders to the Bears. 2, Aaron Donald, Los Angeles Rams. The leader of that defense. Still to this day their best player. Helped them go to the Super Bowl. Number one, no doubt about it, Patrick Mahomes, Kansas City Chiefs, won the MVP that year. He really broke out in terms of a big-time sports player that year. And you could argue they should have been the representative in the Super Bowl that year because obviously Dee Ford goes offsides. The rest is history. Patriots ended up winning that game and winning the Super Bowl. So my number one player of 2018 in the NFL, Patrick Mahomes. And now I'm going to do my top 10 NFL games of the calendar year 2018. So, honorable mentions, I have two. Packers-Rams 2018 Week 8 and Jets-Browns 2018 Week 3. Packers-Rams is just a back-and-forth game. Rams came back from 10 down with 2 minutes to go to win that one against Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. And then 2018 Week 3 Jets-Browns was Baker Mayfield's first game and helping lead the Browns to a comeback win over Sam Darnold and the Jets. 10th place, Bears-Packers 2018 Week 1. Matt Nagy's first game as the Bears head coach. This game probably should have taught us that the Bears were here to stay. Yeah, they blew that game, but they still ended up winning the division that year and going to the postseason. So that really should have taught us a lot about the Bears, but instead it was looked upon as a really bad loss that could cripple them. 9th, Eagles-Cowboys 2018, Week 14. This game went to overtime. Amari Cooper catches the game-winning touchdown in OT. 29-23 was the final. Number 8, Texans-Colts 2018, Week 4. A great game between two of the best teams in that division, or I should say the two best teams in that division at the time. Deshaun Watson helped lead the Texans to a comeback win at the Colts. Really turned the Texans season around. And that game really taught us a lot about Indy now looking back, because Indy ended up making the postseason that year. And Indy started that season 1-5, but there was just bad luck that they lost that game. 7th, Ravens-Chiefs 2018 Week 14. This game went into overtime. The Chiefs wound up winning the game on a field goal by Harrison Butker. Lamar Jackson really did silence some doubters in that game a little bit. Although those doubters ended up coming back in the playoff game against the Chargers that they ended up losing. 6th, Chargers-Chiefs 2018 Week 15. Thursday night game. Great game. Phillip Rivers helping the Chargers come from behind and winning that game. They score the touchdown and go for 2 for the win, and they get it. Rivers to Keenan Allen. And the Chiefs still ended up winning the division that year, but that was a good statement win at the time by the Chargers. 5, Chiefs-Patriots 2018 Week 6. This was a game that everybody was doing jumping jacks for. Mahomes against Brady. But Brady and the Pats come out on top 43-40, and Mahomes and the Chiefs went toe-to-toe with them. 4th, Jaguars-Patriots 2018 AFC title game. Yes, this is the calendar year 2018. That game was in 2018, although it was the 2017 season. Blake Bortles and the Jaguars, they had a lead on the Pats. Tom Brady leads the comeback, and the Patriots are back in the Super Bowl, and the Jaguars go home, and then the Jaguars haven't done anything since. 3rd, Rams-Chiefs 2018 Week 11, an absolute classic game, 54-51 Rams. I talked about this game a little bit a couple weeks ago when it was re-aired. We all know that this was a very hyped-up game. And this game was supposed to be in Mexico City, and it got moved to Los Angeles because something happened in Mexico City. And this turned out to be one of the better Monday Night Football games in the history of Monday Night Football, even though it was such a high-scoring game. 2nd, Patriots-Eagles, Super Bowl 52. Eagles win their first Super Bowl in franchise history. This was a great game. Tom Brady almost did it again that year. The Patriots, you can make a case, should have won this football game. Nick Foles and the Philly special, this game will be remembered for. And then Derek Barnett made that big play on defense to force the fumble from Tom Brady. And that was a big reason why Philly won that game. And then The Patriots still did not quit in that game, and that game pretty much came down to the last play. And number one top 10 game of 2018, Saints Vikings 2018 NFC divisional round, no doubt about it. The walk-off touchdown by Stephon Diggs. Marcus Williams misses the tackle and Diggs runs it into the end zone. That was a crazy play, one of the better calls by Joe Buck in my opinion. Vikings go on to the AFC title game, and that play probably landed Pat Shurmur, the New York Giants head coaching job at the time, and it landed Case Keenum, that big contract he signed for the backup for the Browns, and then landed him that contract with the Broncos and then that trade to the Redskins, and GMs are still living off that game. He's a backup quarterback, but that was his best season of his career. He had a lot of good talent around him, obviously Thielen, Diggs, Rudolph, Cook. So they had a lot of good players around him, and then the Vikings ended up getting crushed, and Keenum ended up getting exposed in that NFC title game against Nick Foles and the Eagles. And obviously the Saints since then have had 2 consecutive heartbreaking playoff losses. Obviously the bad call in 2018, and then the 2018 season, and then in 2019 season in the wild card round home loss against the Vikings, in which you could argue there was offensive pass interference on the game-winning touchdown that sent the Vikings to the second round against the 49ers. So Saints-Vikings has turned into a little bit of a rivalry over the past couple years, but this game really was the standout winner of the top games of the calendar year 2018 in the NFL. That's it for today's show. I'll be back tomorrow recapping the latest news within sports and the coronavirus as well. 2016 MLB ReDraft, 2018 top 10 MLB players and MLB games as well. And I hope you guys have a great day, everyone.